Well, colleagues, thanks for coming. My name's Paul Barnes. It's my great pleasure to be the head of the Risk and Resilience program at ASPI. And coming out on a cold evening with rain threatening, I really appreciate you coming along. Tonight we have an interesting topic, a topic that seems to be at the top of everybody's tongue, resilience in general. But as some context, we know that the cost of natural disasters in Australia is quite significant. Swiss Re in Australia have suggested that the cost of Cyclone Debbie was up to $1.7 billion, the second most expensive cyclone in Australia's history, and in the year that it occurred, the 12th most expensive cyclonic event or hurricane event on the planet. So there's a range of significant costs to Australia from not mitigating the effects of natural phenomena and the cascading industrial or other forms of infrastructure damage that we have. And there have been projections that if these exposures are not mitigated or managed in any effective way, we may reach $33 billion in cost accumulated by 2050. Again, these are projections. They may have degrees of accuracy depending on what we do. At the Asia Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction just completed in Ulaanbaatar, the Secretary-General of the UN suggested that in the last year, extreme weather events were largely responsible for displacing up to 19 million people around the planet. And Asia, in his words and his further commentary, is at risk of contributing to significant amounts of, or at least it did contribute to significant numbers of that total. The Secretary-General Special Representative and Head of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, Mami Mizutori, also said that Asia is a key location for this form of disruption in terms of people being moved either in emergency response for their own safety or being pushed away from their domiciles by this sort of weather. There was also reference at that particular conference to Australia's new Disaster Resilience Taskforce. And there was comment made by the relevant minister that the next ministerial or 2020 ministerial conference will be in Australia. So, Mark, there's no stress or strain in terms of...
No, Jamie's got it.
Okay, we can pass the football or other for later. But the interesting thing is that the Minister said that we will showcase the work of Australia's National Resilience Taskforce in understanding vulnerability based on geography, exposures to hazards and social connectedness and other cascading matrices. We'll shine a light on the Sendai Framework's fourth priority, how to prepare and enhance disaster resilience. But also DFAT in the white paper from last year referenced the movement of people being forced out of homes by weather events and disasters. So it's a critical issue to have a domestic focus on resilience for Australia and also to have Australia's near international views on resilience building. So it's a great pleasure for ASPI to have Mark Crosweller, who is the coordinator of our National Disaster Resilience Taskforce, and Jamie Isbister from DFAT, who is responsible, I think, for many things, and international aid and other things. NGO liaison is one of those key foci. So the task tonight is to hear probably 10 minutes from each of the gentlemen, then a facilitated discussion, then Q&A, and a mystery reportage who I'll introduce in a short time. And then we will do the usual ASPI adult beverages and canapes to continue the discussions. So can I ask Mark to make some preliminary remarks?
Thanks, Paul. Good evening, everybody. Thanks to ASPI for allowing us to come and really speak on behalf of the task force in the first public event, I think, since we've been set up. So we had a policy sprint in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago, and I'll make quite a bit of reference to the outcomes of that, but this is probably the first audience we've had to talk about sort of what we're up to. Look, I think certainly in the Australian context, the thing that really strikes us is if you look forward to 2050, which is what we're trying to do, is to try to sort of take a 30-year view on this. Things that are going to move quicker than they've ever moved in this country is our population increase and the rate of change in climate. and its effect on disaster risk, and they are things we haven't experienced together before. So just setting the stage on those things alone. It's about, I think it's just short of 1 million people a year for the next 15 or 20 years are going to turn up in Australia through migration and all sorts of other things, and where do we place them, and what do the housing stocks look like, what does the land use look like, and what's our understanding of risk in the space that we're about to put these people in. And it's really quite, I think there's quite a bit still to do in terms of our understanding of resilience, particularly around risk reduction. And even in Melbourne, a couple of weeks ago, we tried to disaggregate risk reduction from resilience, and they're interdependent, of course, and there's much in the literature about their definitions, and they are largely boundary objects anyway, but we couldn't disaggregate. It's with 137 people representing 97 or 94 agencies and institutions and private sector entities and community groups and so on and so forth. You couldn't disaggregate risk reduction from resilience. It was just, it's all sort of bundled up in one sort of nice neat package of 137 different interpretations from 94 different organisations. So it's really quite complex. But some key themes came out, I think, and this is sort of, I think it's close to the heart of EMA and the task force, is this notion of trying to get a better handle on what we mean by vulnerability. And it's interesting, if you look across the state strategies, and I've done a bit of work on this, that on average we'll mention the word vulnerability 4 or 5 times, and we mention resilience 300 times in the same document. And we can't speak to vulnerability. We don't have a language for it. Every time we tried to put the word up a couple of weeks ago in Melbourne in the sprint, and people took it off the board. And I find that fascinating, that we are pursuing an agenda of resilience, but what are we trying to be resilient to? And if you take the United Nations framework on risk, hazard, exposure and vulnerability are the 3 components of risk. IPCC says the same thing. We know our hazards quite well. We're still learning, of course, but a lot of energy and time and effort and research has been put into understanding hazard. Exposure is fairly obvious, I think, in terms of land use and where we place ourselves upon the landscape, and we're getting better at capturing that and understanding it. But do we really understand what it is we're vulnerable to? And it's a really interesting question. We will release some work on that in the next few weeks, the result of 18 months of work with a whole bunch of stakeholders around the Australian vulnerability profile. But I just thought I'd mention it tonight. We might sort of explore it a little bit later. Why can't we speak to vulnerability? What is so offensive about the word? We have to rub it off the board. I find that fascinating. And so it leads to some other conundrums, I think. And knowledge of risk in this country is not as good as we think it is. And we've locked a lot of data up and a lot of knowledge up into our systems, behind our legal frameworks, behind our politics, and it's not liberated to the extent of which it ought to be. And I don't think there's a stakeholder we've spoken to who hasn't put knowledge on the agenda as being one of the biggest issues in Australia around risk reduction and how to understand what it is to mitigate for risk. There's a bit of an irony with that, because our resilience strategies say to all the way down to the individual that you should know your risks. Not an unreasonable statement, but we won't tell them what they are because we won't liberate the data. So there's a real ethical question there about if we're going to continue to move forward on resilience strategies and try and encourage individuals and communities to be more resilient, but we won't liberate our knowledge about the potentiality of the landscape. And Ian, you would know this from the Queensland Flood Inquiry, 46% of the recommendations were about absence of knowledge. The 39% about the absence of controls around risk. And now Queensland's done an enormous amount of work since that time. But even in 2011, we had a significant understatement of risk on the Australian landscape and how we understood it. There's a lot of work to be done on climate and disaster risk and the intersections. We have a bit of a language and a bit of a narrative around that. We don't have an agreed understanding. We don't have agreed definitions as to how those two things come together. The banking and finance sectors, particularly those who now have obligations under APRA, I think it is, in terms of directorships and decisions made on behalf of stakeholders, need to take into account changing climate risks and in terms of their decision making, and also the intersections with disaster risk as well. And we really struggle to put narratives or to put, we've got the science for it, but how do you turn it into good policy advice? How do you then take that into the boardroom? Something that we're still, I think we have to do a lot of work Look, the thing I've also noticed, and this came up in our workshop, and we picked this up before we moved into the task force, was how much pressure we are collectively putting on the individual to be resilient. And I heard a comment, an anecdote last week that said, and it kind of summarises, I think, where we're at in terms of risk reduction, at least in some respects, where somebody said, look, we've got to make people more resilient to take pressure off the system. And you think about that, and I've heard that many times. I heard it again 2 weeks ago in Melbourne, and it's right. I thought we've got some narrative and some discourse we need to work with here, because at the end of the day, they're at the end of the risk chain. They're at the end of the risk transfer process, and so if we've got land use planning that's not efficient, or it's not properly dealing with risk and risk reduction. If we are producing harms on the landscape or harms in our systems, or we're sort of responding to those systems in a different way, that risk is being transferred all the way through to the individual. So part of the task force, what it's trying to say to people is, look, a lot of good work has been done in the country, but we have to go back into our systems in society and have another look and see where we can further reduce risk through the decisions that we make that ultimately impinge upon the individual. So there's a lot of narrative around community and individual resilience, and we were a little bit criticised for not engaging the community and individuals more in the task force work, and we've made a conscious decision to refocus the effort back into the system of society to say, look, community and individual resilience is critical, of course it is, and they're an equity partner in resilience, but the system itself is failing in many respects to deliver them a safe environment to start with. So rather than just placing it continually on the individual and community, which is an important part of this dialogue, the system itself has to pick itself up in many respects. I think, and probably the last point I'll talk to, Paul, before I sort of step back for a bit, is the notion of anticipated future and anticipated history. We know that our capacity for risk forecasting, future risk forecasting in this country is getting better, but still needs a lot more maturing. So if we're going to do with rapidly increasing populations and changing climate, our capacity to anticipate future through scenarios needs to continue to mature. But I think what's even more important is, if we're going to talk about risk reduction, we have to talk about what it is we're prepared to lose. If you look at what happened in Japan this week, if we look at what happened in the US not 12 months ago, the losses are significant. I think in some respects we pitch our resource and our public policy to an old frame of reference, so we tend to do a lot of our risk assessment on a historical basis. That's not cutting it in terms of future impact. So anticipated loss, or anticipated history, if you like, if you can call it that, is a mechanism used in climate risk because it's a slow burn issue, and so there's time to navigate the complexities of loss as climate change takes effect, or changing climate takes effect. We would argue that a similar process needs to happen in disaster risk, that we need to go into community and understand the full potentiality of the hazards for which we face, and navigate backwards about what are we prepared to trade or lose, and what are we not prepared to trade or lose. And because we will lose things, the thing is, the things that we do lose, if we're going to lose them, are they acceptable losses or are they unacceptable losses? And I think it will change the mechanisms about how we insure and where we place our values. So look, that's what we've discovered so far. So we'll probably have that solved by next week. Some other issues, but it's been a rich conversation. We've spoken to literally hundreds of people. As I said, there were 97 organisations represented at the sprint, and it's really opened up, I think, a great conversation about resilience and risk reduction. And it just shows, I think, how much has been done. There's clearly a lot of work has been done, but I think probably more importantly going forward on changing climate and population intersections, how much more it is we need to do. So thanks, Paul. I might stop there and hand back.
Jamie.
Thank you, Paul. For those who don't know me, Jamie Isbister, I head the Humanitarian NGO and Partnerships Division of DFAT that sort of manages our response to different humanitarian crises globally, both in our region and more broadly. Just want to sort of feel a bit sort of under pressure here with Robert Glassy here, the former head of UNISDR. Great to have Robert here, and particularly someone with a lot of experience and knowledge around the whole disaster risk reduction agenda. I'm just going to sort of start with the reflections which a lot of my sort of staff hear me sort of talk about too often, but I think it's sort of a useful way to sort of think about the sort of challenges we face around preparedness, response, and risk reduction or recovery, build back better. And from my perspective, sort of been involved in a lot of different crises over many years. I mean, I think the international community, but including government, we've got better at preparedness. I'd probably give us a 6.5 out of 10 on that. We've got better investments on how we prepare. Response, the effort for a whole range of reasons probably give us 7.5 out of 10. But we really fall back down on the recovery reconstruction and probably give us a 4 or 4.5 out of 10 where we sort of fail. And I just sort of reflect on, because it's dominated much of my week, as it has for many others, but just on the sort of international community and Australia's response to the Thai rescue over the last couple of weeks. I mean, there's a lot of criticism government gets, a lot of criticism, government can't work together, they can't. I mean, if you can look at a better example of where a government can come together, can deliver a fantastic outcome and plug that in effectively with the international community effort. The Thai rescue is an example of that with the AFP, our AUSMAT teams, our DFAT teams, our defence assets, and I want to give particular thanks to Joe Bafani from EMA, who's central with a lot of that and mobilising a lot of that sort of capability. But it's an example where we can do it. Government can come together. We can make sure that we sort of, and it's that approach that I think we've got to think about how we're better doing it on the resilience and the risk reduction agenda. When we for a whole range of political and other reasons, we put a lot of effort in that sort of response aspect, and that's important. But we struggle to put it into the one could argue equally, if not more important part of mitigating, preventing, reducing the risk of crises. And I think that's something which fundamentally we as the benefit of establishing the task force domestically, but with the white paper with a very strong focus around building resilience discussion, is trying to look at how we can collectively step up in a much more joined up way on that. How private sector investments, how governments regulation approaches, how our new partnerships are focusing on those important issues of disaster mitigation, disaster risk reduction. So I just thought I'd sort of reflect just briefly on that, because something that's dominated, I guess, quite a lot of this week. Paul talked a bit about the white paper. I just sort of quickly touch on a couple of things that I guess particularly relevant to this discussion. One that, if you've read the white paper, there's a very strong emphasis around building resilience and the challenges we're going to face in our region, Indo-Pacific region, and particularly the responsibility Australia has, and with our partners in the Pacific, to take a strategic and long-term vision to how we're going to build the resilience and ability to deal with the types of crises, types of challenges that we're going to be facing in the coming decades. It talks about stepping up, not just on our agenda in the Pacific, but also on our humanitarian side of things. We're stepping up to $500 million from a current budget of about $400 million. So that's a significant, it's almost a 20% increase in one year. And a lot of that is going to be looking at how we can better, yes, money talks, and money's an important part of it, but how that reflects also the policy settings and agenda that we bring to that whole step up on the humanitarian side, and that we're looking at it in a broader continuum from just simply that, what we see on the televisions and the sort of the responsive nature of it. And so to flag, that's an issue which we're really going to be putting effort into. As Paul mentioned, I was in Mongolia last week with Minister Firavanti Wells, our Minister for Central Development of the Pacific, where she announced that Australia will host the next Asia-Pacific Ministerial Conference here in Australia. And that's in 2020, and that offers us not just an opportunity to show Australia's leadership in this, but use that as a platform over the next 2 years to really think through what are the types of partnerships, the types of priorities that we, Australia and the region, need to be thinking about and looking at these things. And people talk about conferences, they're just talk fests. But for me, the process of working into that and the discussions about what we need to be driving, what priorities we need to be looking at, is really what the guts of those sort of platform and events are. In the white paper, it talks about the Indo-Pacific. It's the most disaster-prone region in the world. 6 out of the top 10 countries are the most disaster impacted each year. Vanuatu, when it was hit by Cyclone Pan, 6.6% of its GDP was impacted. And for the country, the impact on that in terms of agriculture, it's tourism, a whole range of is huge. And we sort of hear about it for the weeks, but in many instances, there's businesses and communities are still recovering from that. Well over 3 years after the crisis, and we know we continue to face this. We've had Cyclone Winston the year after. We've had Cyclone Gita and Tonga earlier this year, and the evidence that we're going to face more intense and more regular crises is a reality, and it's how do we ensure that we are getting the investments and the policy settings right at a local, national, and international level to sort of deliver on that. And the problem we face, and I speak from this, in me being part of the problem at this time, is that DRR is important, but it's not urgent. Building resilience is important, but it's not urgent. The reality is, if we don't invest in the important, then we just keep dealing with the urgent, and it becomes more costly for us. It becomes more reactive, and frankly, it won't be sustainable. I want to then just talk a bit about people talk about building resilience, disaster risk reduction, disaster mitigation. Sort of what is it tangibly? Does it really make a difference? So I just want to give a couple of examples about where, through the work of the Australian government and DFAT, but with partners, it's been a very concrete and real difference. So a couple of examples. In Cyclone Gita, when it hit Tonga. Two interesting facts that came out of that. One of them is we'd invested in one of the islands, Arway, that before then about building a sustainable electricity resilient grid. And when the cyclone went through, it pretty much knocked out the whole power sector in Tonga, which sounds dramatic, lights out, whatever it was. But we in Australia, we sort of often complain about hours off, days, it's a disaster. But in a country where you're talking about weeks and months, that impacts on health services dramatically. It impacts on transport, on businesses, on all the sort of basic logistics of running a country. And the investment we made in our way, basically 20% of that grid went back up again very quickly, compared to 90% of the grid and the rest of Tonga going down. And so it's a very simple but quick example of where investment in building more resilient infrastructure in this sector, energy sector, makes a genuine difference today in a crisis. Similarly on that, we've stepped up on how we look at deploying quickly with partners recovery in the power sector. And so we had jointly with New Zealand over 20 power and poles peoples in there within a week, getting the power sector back up and running and looking at what type of investment need to be made in the longer term to prevent a situation of the next cyclone going through and taking poles and wires down. And I think that's something, again, credit to Joe, we've worked with EMA on it, with Energy Networks Australia. It's the areas about incrementally, how do we not just respond to the crisis, but we build back better. Another good example in Nepal, in May 2012, we were part of a consortium of partners where we invested in retrofitting schools in Nepal to be able to be earthquake resistant to crises. And that was to 169 schools. And in the earthquake that hit Nepal in 2015, none of those schools went down. But thousands of schools went down across Nepal, unfortunately killed many people, but also the infrastructure that was lost from that and the recovery in that sector is still going on today. And so the costs of that retrofitting compared to what Nepal's dealing with now is sort of incomparable. So there's just a couple of quick examples of, I think, about where we know it works, where we can make a difference, but we've got to be stepping up more on that, and that's what the white paper sort of touches on. I just want to sort of then talk about at a broad level how we do it, how we actually deliver better resilience, and DRR is an important factor. And a couple of things on this is that it does mean new partnerships. It means new partnerships with the private sector, particularly with the insurance industry. The insurance industry has data on the next 10 years on the risk challenges and mitigations well ahead of what any of us have and the government has. And this is a sector that we've really got to be able to be engaging with a lot more. We've got to be partnering with how we use that data, how we use that information to work. And that's one of the things with when we host 2020, the Ministerial Conference, that we're going to be wanting to look at how we bring that in. You know, the Sendai framework that is basically an international agreed framework for how we step up on DRR. People sort of say, oh, these agreements, what do they sort of mean? It's a very practical framework about how governments, communities and the international community need to think about a long-term agenda on DRR. And having just come back from the meeting in Mongolia, it is resonating across the way governments are thinking, the way they're planning their regulatory environments, how they're looking at the investments they make now and going forward. And the final thing that I sort of I'll touch on, just on this how, is you know, local. Like, frankly, you know, having worked in the humanitarian environment for over 20 years, having been involved in the preparedness, the response and the recovery sort of side of it, having been involved in the discussions leading the World Humanitarian Summit, one of the biggest themes that kept coming out is the need to be looking at how your engagement, your consultations and your work on this is driven at a local level. And that the way that you think about what responses are needed is driven bottom up rather than from a top-down sort of agenda of what governments, the international community, and talking about the importance that government has on all that. The actual responses have to be driven from a localised effort and a localised agenda. So look, I might finish there. I'm happy to talk a little more later, Paul, on issues around what we sort of may be looking at going into the 2020 conference and how we may engage others in it. But more than happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Jamie. Colleagues on the with me left and right, one of the issues that is always
use the microphone, please?
Certainly. One of the perennial issues in changing systems is do we know how to change the system, and do we have a full understanding of where there could be opportunities and weaknesses or even vulnerabilities in the way that systems are designed, the way they're implemented and the way they're managed. Mark, you mentioned that one of the key issues of the task force is to understand better where you can put the right amount of pressure to change the system to betterment. Are there any specific low-hanging fruit items regarding to how to change the system and where the pressure should be put?
Look, I think there is. When we've looked at our risk methodologies, for example, they're quite institutional, they're quite jurisdictional, they're quite hazard specific. And picking up on Jamie's point about, the thing we picked up in the sprint 2 or 3 weeks ago is the plethora of stakeholders that are in this space that we don't directly engage with in our risk assessment. So often, the frontline services or the governments know something about the risk. They don't know all of it because the knowledge isn't fully expressed, but they know something about it. But it doesn't actually necessarily translate to industry and into the sector. And when we spoke to the industry sectors, their risk profiling is a lot different. They do it on business continuity, they do it on OH&S, they do it on shareholder value. They're all very important. But do they take an integrated approach to the risk assessments? Well, no, they don't. Well, I was talking to someone from the rail sector, and that they almost had me convinced that they don't have a natural hazard problem in Australia. And I didn't quite know how to broach that subject with them because they were so convincing that they didn't. And so because they've never really assessed it, or I don't think to the extent to which we understand it and its potentiality in the landscape, particularly moving forward, that they are of the view it's not a problem and they deal with floods every day of the week and they can recover within 4 to 8 hours. And what we're dealing with in terms of future climate and disaster risk scenarios is far more profound than your average 1 in 10, 1 in 15 year flood that might happen every couple of years. So I think to pick up on Jamie's point, there's a much richer conversation to be had with stakeholders about what is it that we mean by disaster and climate risk, and how does that relate to every aspect of the system, which ultimately is there to support society and individuals and communities that are so important in this process. So I think we've been traditionally quite siloed, and we have a habit of looking backwards all the time at historical data, and that isn't going to work. it's indicative of potentiality in terms of the type of event. It's not indicative in terms of the potentiality of severity or frequency for that matter. So I think there's a lot more openness that's required in our assessments. And I think that, and so when we looked in, and it happens at the federal level as well, but also at the state level, the governance doesn't line up to be able to do that. So a lot of our hazard assessments across the country are done often in hazard agencies, not necessarily, you know, across hazards and a more comprehensive view. A couple of states are governanced for that, but most of the states in fact aren't. And when we sort of quizzed them and said, well, how do you roll up and take a true all hazards view to your risk profiling, it's done at a state level at quite a superficial level, but you can't navigate all the way down to that thing there of the landscape, which is a piece of critical infrastructure that everyone's got to rely upon when something happens. So our governance doesn't line up, our capability's not quite in place, and our processes don't necessarily benefit everybody. So if we don't tackle those things first, I think we're going to be flying in the face of the wind for a while, I suspect. So there's some. I'm not saying we get back to basics, but I do think. Well, I probably am saying that on some respects, that we've moved so far in some of these debates, but we've sort of left a few bits behind, and I think we've got to go back and tidy them up again. So.
Well, Jamie, I can't even imagine what the international engagement pressures are, given that we have a domestic picture that has some dots that have not yet been joined up. Is it easier or more difficult in the international multilateral world?
I'm sure Mark will probably tell you it's easier, which, you know, probably true at some level, because I mean, domestically you are much more directly connected to your constituents or whatever else at times internationally. But no, I mean, in terms of the system aspect of it, I mean, sometimes I think, you know, I'm not saying that I don't agree with the need for system thinking, whatever else, but sometimes we try and focus too much about trying to work out if we can just get the system sort of ordered correctly, then we'll get the sort of right outcomes. And my view is that actually, in terms of looking at the issue about how we better tackle risk and risk reduction in crises, is one, better understanding the challenges we face, and then being more honest and bringing together the stakeholders and the people who can be part of that solution. And that's quite a wide group. And I think too often as government or others, we can start with sort of saying, well, let's ourselves identify what we think the problem is, and then we start reaching out, well, who can we get to sort of help us solve that? And by doing that, we sort of have too much of a hub and spoke. We're sort of the middle of the wheel, and we're sort of out sort of connecting with people depending. Whereas I think really, you know, my experience, the best sort of investments around risk reduction is having clarity of what the problem we're trying to deal with is, but then having the flexibility of bringing in people to then look at how you can come to that solution. And that comes again to my point about giving that local agency and permission to sort of, with support resources, to be able to effectively deliver on them.
What are some of the pressures of actually when you're working in an aid context and your end user, the local affected individuals or economies, have a different perception of what the problems are as compared to the groups that may be coming to assist or wanting to anticipate where benefit could be invested in for the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's two things. I mean, one of them is, I think, often the challenge on that is the want, like all politicians and whatever else, and that is to want to be able to quickly solve problems and quickly get outcomes and get things back up and running and get things back to normality, which is all sort of understandable. But the risk on that is, the temptation is to sort of get the band-aids out, and that's where I think you can get the resources about sort of, you know, just getting kids back into school, so get the galvanised iron back up again, you know, get the sort of bamboo sort of thing, whatever else it might be, and you know, and that can, you know, take away from that opportunity to actually look at building back better and building back in a sense that we know that this community infrastructure is something which is not only going to overcome the problem we've got from this crisis, but is going to ensure that we're not repeating this in 12 or 24 months' time. So I think the same problems we face in Australia are the same often challenge you're facing, and politics is worldwide on that issue. The second issue I think is, you know, and this is again a problem that was interesting. Mark was talking about vulnerability and the lack of. One of the big challenges I've seen is that You can't underestimate when a crisis occurs. We know the most impacted. The people who are most impacted are the most vulnerable. Women, people with disabilities, whatever else. And more often than not, particularly people with disabilities, it's often because they're not seen. You know, it's often because they're actually hidden, both physically and the system has a way of sort of. And so the problem with that is that then both in the response, their needs and concerns are not necessarily being addressed or understood. But when you're then looking at what investments we need to make in terms of risk mitigation, risk reduction, those voices, those considerations are not being looked at and addressed in that going forward. And that's often a big challenge we face with when we're working with countries, and that is saying, well, how do we get beyond the responding to the needs of the loudest or the most prominent or the most vocal to actually those who are potentially the most vulnerable, and and that's not easy.
Do we need to become more human? Do we have to have more connectivity with the people that are in our communities?
Yes, we do actually. Absolutely. I think, and just continuing on the thread of vulnerability, that we operate in an institutional frame that sees itself largely as invulnerable, and we see vulnerability as being others. But the complexity and the intensity and the frequencies of what we have faced and will face into the future make everybody vulnerable, and we really struggle to speak to that. So, when our systems fail fundamentally, when our resources either run out or are ineffective, and these hazards, basically, run across the landscape and do as they choose for as long as they want, whatever conditions prevail, puts us into a whole different world. And so it makes us as vulnerable as those that we serve. And it's not a narrative that's easy to navigate in institutional frames, because and when we go out and talk to people and say, look, here's a scenario, how do you think you'll go? A lot of people say, yes, my plan fits that scenario, and it's a scenario that is way off the scale, but still has a possibility, still has a reality to it. And this is what happened in Hurricane Katrina, where people had plans and were confident that their plans would meet the intensity of the hazard, and clearly it didn't, but they were still trying to operate against their plans, and the plans were failing all over the place, and so they couldn't move their institutional thinking away from those things that they had reversed. I've said this for many years now, that the greatest measure of success in this business is the upholding of public trust and confidence, and the greatest mission is the reduction of human suffering. And we really have to understand what that looks like in the context of those that we serve. The notion of anticipated history is critical, I think, that we have to develop a language, a narrative and a process to take people to the other end of a crisis before it happens and step back through it again. And so how do we navigate this together? Because if you take towns like Yarloop, for example, and the impacts of losing the entire town to a bushfire that no one saw coming and didn't anticipate, the complexities of having to navigate that are extraordinary. The mayor of Marysville is not the council area, but the mayor who looks after Marysville said two really profound things, I think, to the ABC about 18 months after the fires in 2009. She said, I don't know how we're going to afford all this stuff, and because people turned up with a lot of generosity and they built things they never had before, so a lot of that was out of sympathy. But she said, more importantly, she said, I wish we thought about this before the fire. And so we actually have an opportunity, as painful as it may seem, to actually anticipate through imagination what impact and loss may look like, and how do you navigate back through and start to work out how you would position for that. And that is a human response, because then you're in the same space as the people who are about to lose something, and you share that experience as you navigate through the narrative. But we have paternalistic narratives that say, when that thing happens, don't worry, you'll come in and we'll help fix it. And the evidence is really loud. And Jamie, you make a really good point that often recovery is at the whim of the timeframes of the government and the agenda or the budget or the program period. And some people aren't ready for that. They haven't yet navigated the loss in their own way, and they need time to think about it and reflect. And we are already building things back before they've had a chance to think about it. Why is that? In part because we wouldn't speak to loss before it happened. Why is it? Because we're invulnerable, because we don't consider vulnerability and loss. We only consider resilience and strength. So really, if we're going to get serious about this, moving into the future, we have to join them. And the other thing we have to trade is our equities of power, wealth and resource. And the evidence is compelling on that as well, that we say we want to engage community in recovery, but we won't trade the equities. So we won't trade the powers, and we don't trade the resources and the wealth to partner with community to navigate through that complexity. There's still paternalistic narratives that turn up and try and sort of push people through a fairly narrow frame of reference. Now that's changing, but it's not pervasive yet. So how do you sort of trade those equities with local governments or state governments or other official institutions and rebalance it and give community a genuine say in these things? That's got to be thought about well before that thing happens. So I come back to the point, we have to anticipate loss much better than we ever have and develop a narrative that comes from here, not here. It's not an economic conversation, it's a human conversation about how can we position this much better. Now that's a big challenge for institutions, but if you look at the trust ratios and the trust deficits that are going on between governments and society, that we're on a shallow slide really. Other parts of society are much steeper than ours, but it's still sliding backwards. And so I think so we've done some many good things, but I think we need to fundamentally shift how we deal with this 30-year problem and what's coming up. Those old frames of reference and practices are not working. Tata is another one. Tata is recovering well overall, but it is showing up some tensions and some stresses in the relief and recovery space, and they're actually not obvious. So I actually ring residents down there and I know a few people down there. I just ring and take a bit of a poll. And it's really interesting what they say. They recognise they're appreciative of all the efforts, but they still feel disengaged and disempowered and not part of the process. They won't say that publicly because it's a small town, but they'll confide privately that they think there's much more to be done. So we do good things, but we need to be more human. We need to, I think, really engage them in the space for which they're about to travel, and try and unpackage that as best as we can.
I know in terms of the investment world that UNEP has a resilient investment conference in Sydney next week, looking about how the finance industries globally and regionally can better try to anticipate resilient thinking in financial investment world, specifically around there. One of the issues of anticipation is that Hurricane Katrina, a year before it manifested, a group of planners within government decided that a hurricane just like Katrina had such a small likelihood of occurring that they were going to discount any issues about mitigation or planning. And then a year later, exactly the same scenarioed event came in from the ocean and did what it did. One of the issues for me looking at cooperation is we have some sort of distance to go domestically in terms of understanding. Are there things from international diplomacy that can be sort of ported across to the domestic realm, do you think, Jamie, in terms of how we do things, in terms of diplomats engaging in an appropriate way, careful, measured and engaging? Are there things that can cross from the domestic to the international and international to domestic?
Yeah, well, I'll be quick on it because probably should have got questions on someone else, but I'd probably just quickly say, look, I think the answer is very simply yes. I think it's something we probably haven't done as well as we could, and I'm saying that in terms of DFAT, whatever else, we haven't always been looking at how we can look at experience internationally and then look at where it can be connected back in and make linkages between our domestic and our sort of partners overseas. It's an issue which is a much stronger focus coming out of our own capability review a few years ago of how we better do that. But I think that's one of the big upsides we have these days with the information technology, with transport, is the ability to learn lessons from others is as strong as ever. And I think we do need to be looking at how we share that, how we share our experience, what's worked, what hasn't, and equally that we're looking at how we're drawing on that from others, and not always looking at it simply from the perspective of what's the latest world-leading technology and experience on this. To be frank, some of the best experience on DRR can come from very long-term traditional practices, from very long-term cultures and traditions that some of these issues are not altogether new, but we have had a history of forgetting them. And I think part of it is looking at how do we re-look at those, and then how do we think how they're relevant in our way of living and culture today.
I agree with Jamie. I think history has a habit of repeating itself only because we don't take the lessons from it. And much of our Indigenous culture, for example, has enormous contributions to make to how to be resilient in this country, and how to even forecast. I often say this, that all antecedent conditions in natural hazards, apart from earthquakes, are highly overt. And the landscape and the atmosphere will give you plenty of signals as to what's coming up, but we've forgotten how to read them. So we get surprised when the catastrophic bushfire weather day turns up, and really it started 3 months earlier with a severe drought. So our Indigenous populations really kind of can narrate this, can speak to the landscape and understand what's happening, and just as an example of being resilient. So look, I was only saying today in the office that none of this is actually new. So the subject matter is not new. Probably in some respects the challenges aren't new. What's new is the context. With a rapidly increasing population and a rapidly changing climate and all that comes with it. So if you look into any of the subject areas, so we've talked about this before. We've talked about resilience and mitigation and all those things, and what's new. So what's the new cut through? What's the new buzzword? Well, I don't think there's any new buzzwords anymore or cut through. I think it's a recontextualisation and a repositioning for a much more complex future. So if anyone's looking for the new buzzword they're all going to go and blindly follow, I would suspect that's probably a little bit of a distraction. We probably should go back and reconsolidate. I'm not quite sure you answered your question, but I thought I'd make that point.
Very well put, both of you. Colleagues, before I open up the floor for questions to either yourselves or to my colleagues on the left or right, many of you may know that Dr. Robert Glasser, who is the former Special Representative and Head of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, is a visiting fellow at ASPI. And earlier today I dropped on Robert's table the opportunity, or at least the challenge, which he has taken up, to make a few comments from the international perspective, looking into the sorts of issues that Jamie is challenged by and works to, and the sorts of issues that the National Taskforce is. Robert, could you make a few comments before I open the floor, if you wouldn't mind?
Sure, it would be my pleasure. Thanks, Paul. Good to see you, Mark and Jamie, and thank you for your comments. Maybe just to pick up on a couple of points. The first point, just to pick up on a couple of points. Jamie's comment about this very practical Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which has implications both for Australia's aid program, and also Australia has obligations, commitments under that framework to address disaster risk. And it is a really practical area of work. We've seen over the last decade huge progress in reducing loss of life from disasters as a result of better early warning, as a result of concerted efforts to involve communities in rapid evacuation, storm shelters. A great example is two very similar cyclones that struck Bangladesh some decade apart. The first one killing tens of thousands of people. The second, with very similar storm track and intensity, there were hundreds of people that died. The newspaper story was that hundreds of people died. The real story was that tens of thousands of people didn't die. And this is part of the challenge with this issue of disaster risk reduction, that the awareness and benefits of that and getting that message out. So I think it is an extremely practical area of work, and there is enormous low-hanging fruit in this area, and that is one reason why countries are actively pursuing it. I want to comment on Mark's observations about the connections between climate risk and disaster risk. 80% of major disasters over the past decades have been hydrometeorological disasters, the ones that are increasing in frequency and severity as a result of climate change. And what you see in many countries around the world is disaster risk being managed, disaster risk reduction strategies being developed by disaster management agencies, and climate change adaptation strategies being developed by environment ministries. They're not communicating with each other, even in spite of this connection between climate and disaster risk, and the finance ministries are nowhere to be seen in the discussion. So they each come up with a wish list of investments that don't become embedded in budget processes and the like. And this is where Mark's comment about data is so important, because what's necessary to engage finance ministries is an understanding of the costs. And so you need that historical view of it. What of these disasters, how often have they happened, and what have they cost us? And then you need to match that, as Mark said, with a risk projection of the future, because with climate change, we have 1 in 100-year events becoming 1 in 20-year events now. So if you make your choices based on 1 in 100-year events, you are going to be in serious strife. And with those two pieces, the history and the projection, you can come up with a dollar amount that then can resonate with finance ministries who are looking at the cost-benefit outcomes. So I think that's really important. I wanted to also comment about the fact, the two trends, I think, that are increasing disaster risk in spite of the progress we've made. The one is poorly planned economic development, the equivalent of building hospitals in flood zones or on earthquake faults, and the population growth issues and huge investments in infrastructure. Something like 60% of the infrastructure that will be built in the next 3 decades, the huge amounts of infrastructure investment over the next 3 decades equates to 60% of the existing stock of infrastructure. It's a once-in-a-lifetime or historically investment in infrastructure. If all of that is poorly risk-informed, we will never reduce disaster risk. And something like 70% of that is private sector investment, not government, which highlights the urgency of involving government and of course, private sector, local communities and private sector in reducing disaster risk. So I think there's a lot more we could say. I think the final point, just on Jamie's comments about how we share internationally with domestically in Australia. Actually, what I've seen is there are many developing countries that are further ahead in this agenda than many OECD countries are. And we have a lot to learn from them about how they're actually incorporating risk in their planning. They tend to be countries that are buffeted every year, countries like Bangladesh or the Philippines, that are buffeted every year by these enormous hazards. And so it is really part of core economic development and planning to embed them. But they've made some huge progress, as has private sector. The SK Prime malls in Manila, for example, toured one mall that is designed for the basement to flood. In the floods, it's a relocation spot for the community. All the pillars in the basement car park are round instead of square so that the debris slides out and they drain and this is the private sector commitment to engage with the community and the government to reduce the risk of disasters. So anyway, but really interesting, and congratulations on the policy sprint, Mark. That was really a remarkable initiative. Thanks.
Thank you. Colleagues, the floor is yours. Questions. If you could just identify who you are, where you're from, as you ask the questions, assuming you have a question or two.
G'day. Am I on? G'day. I can speak loudly anyway. That's all right. Jordan Bartlett, KCL Engineering. We specialise in designing for earthquake for the interior. So we have a structural engineering code in Australia. Our structures will survive if they're built correctly, but the interior of all of our post-disaster facilities are being ignored due to a lack of knowledge. But this is part of our resilience. So when I present on these topics, most of the time I think we need to be focusing on what we look at what we got right. We also need to look at what variation in the elements could have occurred and where would we have got it wrong. Because Newcastle, we look at Newcastle and go, oh, terrible earthquake. Well, it actually wasn't. It was a public holiday 3 days after Christmas. No one was home. It was a shutdown city. Bus strike that day. 300 to 500 people have been killed that day. But we don't have a lived memory. So these countries you're talking about have a lived memory. They act upon it. There's so many gaps. And this whole state didn't know until today that they weren't complying with the code until they got hold of the building department, the CAT department. There is so many little gaps in our resilience. It's amazing how hospitals aren't designed. So Debbie didn't have enough diesel to run their hospital for more than 4 hours. But they had to run for 14 hours straight. They didn't have enough food. They didn't have so many other elements. We're not doing special studies on what our disaster management facilities need to survive. So it's simple stuff, but I keep getting pushed back from so many departments who don't have, sorry mate, don't have the budget, don't have the time, don't have the care. I don't have a lived memory of that, so that's not my problem. Or we don't have the expertise. And I'm so happy to hear about this sprint, because this is the only way you're going to get it. And I phoned 8 companies in this city before I came here. Not one of them knew about their requirements under the structural code for the interior, because it's all fixed to the moving inter-story drift, the columns, the external facade. The ceiling is connected right now to an aluminium profile, which can't take the load. This is all simple stuff. But no one's
Any
bothered.
comments?
The thing I would say is, and you mentioned in part with what you said, is there pops up invulnerability. We don't have the budget, we don't have this, we don't have that. That's kind of like denial, and we have a system that on some level denies. And we talked for a number of years about accepting the premise of inevitability, not because we want one, but because you don't get to choose them anyway. So if you don't get to choose the thing and there's an inevitability in your hazard profile about the manifestation of an event, you would do well to fully understand it and make sure you're properly positioned for it. But we lack the imagination or the will to do that. So we have a false optimism in society that says, and like 1 in 100 years, for example, particularly in the flood space, is rather a subjective measure, I've got to say. It's how that's calculated. It's not to any specific standard in Australia that I'm aware of, and I'm happy to be corrected on that. But so we trade on the rarities, but the rarities don't reduce the consequences. And I've said this for a long time as well, that if you're in the space of government or you represent a pillar of society, you cannot exit this space when something bad happens. You can't exit it. So the market might be able to exit because it's either gone broke or it's too expensive, so it doesn't enter, or it's, as I said, it goes broke. But any pillar of society or government institution is in it for go to way. So we would do well to fully understand the potentiality of the things that we will have to manage through. But we don't have that thinking in this country. So we trade off on rarities and we trade off on likelihoods. So somehow there needs to be a shift in narrative and a shift in culture. And some of the things you're suggesting, I think, have potentially, I worked in engineering years ago, I've been out of it for over 20 years, but potentially have quite considerable, I think, cost imposts on design. And now maybe that's not true. Maybe it's just about innovation, I'm not sure. And if it is, then we should promote a conversation that takes those things into account. So she'll be right, kind of works to a point, it's got us this far, reasonably well. Will it work in the future? I suspect probably not. And so how do we liberate the conversations and have sensible conversations about potentiality without scaring people, but with accepting, the realities of the future? And as Robert says, if we're going to put 60% more infrastructure on the landscape in the next few years, we do well to do that as well as we possibly could. My fear is that we won't in fact do that expediency and other things will take over, and we'll end up wonking things on the landscape out of ignorance because the knowledge isn't properly expressed, or out of some other motivation that's less than those things we're trying to achieve here tonight. So.
Anu Mukur, I'm active secondary to the Australian. Anu Mukur, I'm active secondary to the Civil Military Centre, and this is a question for you, Jamie. Is Build Back Better a great slogan but a bad idea? Very often there are multiple interpretations of what better is, and those who are most vulnerable often are not involved in defining what better means. And often we see that better is defined as do what the international paradigm tells you to do.
Well, my answer is probably yes and no. I mean, yes, I think that Build Back Better is a slogan, and yes, it is at times used, like in a lot of things, to impose certain views, perspectives, approaches that are not necessarily informed or owned by local communities. No, it's not simply a slogan and whatever else, in the sense that, it's serious if we don't look at how we're building back services, communities, homes, infrastructure that's able to be resilient to future crises. Then we have a moral then there's a moral question and responsibility. I think what you're getting at is my point earlier about the importance of localisation and the importance of being able to ensure that the decisions and the approaches being made have got the voice perspective of local communities, of local organisations, of local businesses reflected into it. And that's a broader humanitarian development challenge. It's a broader challenge even in the Australian community that we've got to deal with. So what you're highlighting is a very real issue, but it's not a reason not to be looking at how we're ensuring that we're building back better. It's the how we do it that needs
I think there are many forms of better. Depends who you're talking to. Was there a question over on the left?
No.
There's a question in the centre there.
Thank you. Ian Mackenzie, Inspector General Emergency Management, Queensland. And thanks, Jamie, Robert and Mark, for your comments. I can't help but think if we were sitting around the boardroom table and we're talking about risk and risk analysis and BCP or DRR, someone would eventually say, what is our risk appetite? And we'd have to overtly answer that. I think that's a conversation that's missing. And I'd be really interested, how do we take that overt conversation to the community and say, there are levels of risk we just have to accept, and this is it?
So I come back to my point about navigating loss ahead of time. And because often what happens is that people's values will shift through a crisis. So what they think they value before something happens, it changes after something happens. So even if you say to people, do you have a risk appetite for X? Or without proper due consideration and regard for the problem, they probably pick a certain values or a certain level of risk appetite. Once that thing manifests, that appetite is a lot less than it was before it started. So, so you can deal with that appetite economically, through economics and rates of return and CBAs and everything else, and that's one way of doing it. But that's not what we're talking about here. It's about the human condition. And so, look, I keep coming back to the point that I don't think we have the mechanisms, the processes, nor the narratives to have that conversation with the community. Because on some level we have an invulnerability that's in our institutional framing. And on another level we've got a community that kind of doesn't want to know about it anyway. So how do you sort of motivate them into that space sensibly? So we are going to have to trade off as we navigate this. There's no doubt about it. And that is risk appetite. But those losses should be informed much more than just economic loss. They need to be commensurable. So, the economic and social impacts for which you can assign a value, but the incommensurables, loss of place, loss of identity, loss of artefact, loss of relic, loss of memory, and all those sort of things. That you can't discount those things in the human experience. And if you try and put a value on those things, they'll ultimately will subordinate them because they'll never be as economically valuable as the house or the building or whatever the case might be. So how do you balance the incommensurables with the commensurables and take the whole picture into account as you navigate through risk appetite? You can see how much work we have to do, and I think we're up for it, but we've got to drop some of these traditional frames of reference and kind of become, as Paul said, a little more human and perhaps a little more humble and start trading, as Jamie said, some of those equities of power, wealth and resource and that community in more than we ever have. Are we really prepared to do that? Do you know what I mean? I think we need to.
Absolutely.
But are we prepared to do it?
Well, I mean, the only thing I would say is I think, not to go into any more real depth on it, but just say I think the issue is being transparent about the risk appetite and people understanding that. And sometimes the problem is that we can come in and sort of say we can reduce the risk and we can mitigate this, whatever else. People, again, not feeling very onerous, so their assumption then is, well, it won't happen again. Well, it will. It hopefully doesn't happen as badly as it did and whatever else. And those balances between what the discussion needs to be and people being, because then it comes back to the ability of people themselves in understanding what that is. What is it that I need to do, or how can my community, or how can my family, or how can try and ensure that in understanding that we have a role within it. Otherwise, yeah, we're taking that top-down sort of system view that we can, if we just do this right, we can get rid of risk altogether. And we know that's not true.
Colleagues, I don't want to get in between yourselves and the adult beverages and canapes that ASPI is famous for, but we have one more question from the floor, then we will go outside and you can continue discussion. Jamie has to leave us, but Mark will stay to the bitter end, hopefully.
Depends if they are drinking.
Thank you very much. My name's Brendan. I'm an emergency services communications professional. My question is just talking about some of the stuff that Jamie, you were talking about in the Pacific area. How can we make the communications side of disaster and response more resilient in terms of perhaps new technologies such as DRM shortwave or mesh nets, CubeSats and things like that, so that we can both get that warning out to people when it's coming, when we see the cutback on the traditional analogue services, and also using ourselves and for ourselves being able to communicate back to places of safety or less impact on the disaster. So I'm thinking things like shortwave.
Yeah.
Those.
So look, just to say, look, I think it's a really good question, and I think it's something which we are certainly very focused on, and I'd be happy sort of separately to have a follow-up discussion on it. But I think my experience on this is that we've got better at getting the warning systems that we have in place are as good as ever been in relation to getting information to capitals or key points.
Yeah.
But in the Pacific Islands, as we know, where you're often dealing with very remote communities, very remote areas, the ability to get that message out then to is a challenge, and it's about getting the right message too, because what we might think is the right early warning system in Australia may not be the right system for some Solomon Islands or something, and so I think there's good news on it, which is I think there's a focus and that we've got better technology than we've had. The bad news is, as you know, we are starting to turn off some of our analogue and whatever else systems, and there's been communities who've been dependent upon those, and we need to ensure that we're able to replace those with better systems that can still ensure that people aren't dependent upon others to get a message that they themselves have got ability to sort of. But I'd be happy, separately to talk on that. But I think it's a very real issue and one that we know makes a real difference. I mean, you look at Vanuatu, the biggest cyclone that went through the southern hemisphere ever, massive impact on infrastructure. 10 people died, 10 too many, but and a lot of that down to early warning systems, preparedness, and a lot of that local preparedness and capability. There's a lot of issues that we're looking at how we sharing with other Pacific communities. How do we learn from that? How do we ensure that can be replicated across other areas?
Colleagues, could I ask you to join me in thanking Mike, Jamie and Robert?